Well, here we are today talking about refutation. And what do we mean by refutation? Basically, we mean that you critically analyze and, if you will, attack or criticize the arguments and the positions, the ideas that are presented by opposing advocates. And in a debate situation, by someone who's arguing the other side of the question against you. I think that this is really one of the components of argumentation that we don't see often enough, and that's not carried on in enough depth in much of our public discourse, where specific arguments and ideas presented by opposing advocates are critically analyzed and criticized. Let's talk about the different elements that exist in the process of refutation. Refutation should be fairly specific. It's very easy to have a general refutation. I don't like your idea. It seems silly. We've never done it before. I mean, these kinds of things may sound nice to some audiences and might be a rhetorical feature of your presentation. But to be really effective, refutation needs to be specific. If you get into the inner workings of opposing arguments and you show how that they don't work, that they're illogical, that they're inadequate, then you can really overcome them. So it tends to be specific. It also recognizes that an argument exists. It indicates what argument that it's responding to. You don't just generally say, well, about their proposal for national health insurance, I think that this, that, and the other. Instead, you would see yourself as refuting specific parts of that proposal, the arguments for it, the statements of why it is needed, the statements of how it will succeed, that it will be economical, that it will provide high quality care. For example, you might want to recognize that they have an argument that says that many people are denied medical care without universal coverage. You would recognize that as an important argument, and then you would engage it. Following that, you would engage in the process of disagreement. You would disagree with them. You would disprove that. You would show how that argument was untrue, inadequate, illogical, using any of the tools of refutation that we're going to talk about in this particular presentation. Finally, it's important to use the refutation process in the overall context of the argument and the discussion. You need to relate your particular refutation to decision making. For example, if you show that people can be covered and can receive medical care now, and that they are not being denied care, that really removes a very important foundation of the argument in favor of national health insurance. When you remove that, perhaps you want to reject the whole argument. One of the major reasons why you would adopt national health insurance is eliminated and overcome, and so you would want to use that to explain why this means that your side of the argument is superior. Don't just disagree. It's not enough just to say no every time they say yes, and yes every time they say no, and stop every time they say go. I think there's an old song by the Beatles that has some of these lyrics in them. You want to do more than that. Certainly you want to disagree and refute, but you also want to use that to show how, in the overall argumentative scheme of the discourse, that your position is superior. I want to just mention the first technique that we're going to highlight today in terms of how to refute arguments, and I call that the challenge. The challenge. These are challenges that you make to opposing advocates. A challenge is an argument which indicates inadequacies in the arguments of opponents and urges their rejection or degradation in terms of their logical power as a result. Sometimes in debates we refer to this as a press. You press against the argument of an opponent. But I prefer the term challenge because, you know, the latter term of a press has also been used to characterize weak demands for perfection. Oh, your evidence comes from last month, not from today. Or, oh, the expert you cite has only been involved in the field for 10 years instead of 20 years. A challenge specifically identifies logical and developmental inadequacies in argumentation and then reevaluates the argument based on these inadequacies. Failure by the other side to deal with these challenges and fill in these inadequacies means that their evaluation of the argument is defeated and your position stands. Now, the format for an effective challenge to make when you're refuting someone's argument is fairly basic. And it's a two-step process in making a challenge. First, you specify the lacking element. You specify the lacking element. Something is missing or something is imperfect about an argument that they've made. Perhaps an argument is missing a logical step, or involves some sort of argumentative fallacy, or confuses the specific with the general. These elements can be specified and pointed out in attacking their argument. The second step is to demonstrate the importance of this lacking element. Now that a problem has been found in a particular argument, it needs to be reevaluated based on this new characterization. The error that many debaters make is assuming that because an argument by an opposing advocate is not perfect, it should be rejected. And it's not an either-or thing. You don't just decide that an argument is perfect or an argument should be rejected. Rather, it's more credible to say that the argument is not as strong as it was, or lacks as much relevance as we might have first thought to the point that opposing advocates are trying to prove. This approach is much harder to answer than mere pleas for argumentative perfection. As well, if and when such challenges are not answered by your opponents, then you can begin discussing why this inadequacy means that their entire argumentative position is faulty, weak, logically inadequate, and should be rejected. The important points to remember here are how to reevaluate an argument based on the challenge that you're making and the extension of challenges not responded to by your opponents. I think it's easy to point out to audiences that if you've made important challenges and showed inadequacies in their arguments and these remain not addressed by them, then it shows that their position is inadequate and shouldn't gain the assent or acceptance of the audience. Once more, I just want to state that in making a challenge, you're not asking that the other side's arguments, or evidence for that matter, be perfect. You're pointing out shortcomings in them. You're challenging them to prove that those shortcomings do not exist. And to the extent that they can do that, then I think that your challenge has been met, and it's no longer the kind of argumentative strategy that you would want to keep promoting. But what happens is that if your challenges are reasonable and logical and make sense to people, then you really bog down your opponents in answering these challenges. It puts them on the defensive, and so it can be very valuable both in the argumentative context of defeating their arguments, but it also makes them look bad, as if they were on the defensive. And if you can use something to gain both substantive and symbolic advantage in the argumentative situation, I think you want to use it. So that's the first technique of refutation we want to point out, the challenge. Remember, it's not a demand for perfection, but it is a critical analysis of the kinds of arguments that opposing advocates could be making. Challenge away.
Hello, I'm here to discuss the issue of refutation as it applies to the central ideas of an opponent's argument. Let me begin by talking about the issue of argument anticipation. Argument anticipation. debate is a series of presentations. We know this from the definition of debate. Debate is both about the advancement of an idea and the disputation of that idea, meaning that there have to be at least two speeches to make a debate. So we know that it's about a series of presentations, a series of ideas. Most formal contest debating involves many more speeches than the presentation of two speeches. Many events involve 6 to 8 distinct presentations in a debate. So we know that debate is about a series of presentations advancing ideas. The issue then is how to anticipate what's going to occur at the end of the debate, presumably the more important stages of the debate that take into consideration all of the ideas that have been used prior to those speeches, as well as new information in those speeches as well, and new evaluations of the issues toward the end of the debate. How could one anticipate those ideas so as not to be so predictable that one falls into all the traps set by clever opponents? So the issue of argument anticipation is the foundation for meaningful refutation, and it doesn't matter what the issue is of refutation, refuting the central ideas of your opponent, refuting narrative testimony, refuting issues of causation. Argument anticipation is central to all of these. As for the issue of argument anticipation, one assesses one's own arguments and then asks the following questions. When I make this presentation, what will they say? That gives you the presentation from your opponent. And then you need to ask yourself, what will I say then? How will I answer the issues that they will raise in the debate? After all, debate is not about truth-seeking. No one in a 45-minute or hour-long debate is going to resolve the question as to whether or not liberty is more important than equality, or whether or not the United Nations should intervene on behalf of human rights in other countries. These issues are very complex and can be argued well beyond the time limits of a single debate. And so we're not looking for truth-seeking in a debate. What we're really looking for is advantage-seeking. Can one, in a limited amount of time, present information in a way to demonstrate that their opinion is sufficiently superior to an opponent's position? It's the skill associated with that kind of relative position in a debate that one is seeking through the practice of debate. And so it's necessary for us to have an edge on our opponent, and like every sport or other competitive game, debate is about the challenge of anticipating the moves from an opponent and then using one's skill to make moves that will successfully trump the positions that others might make, or in an anticipated way make moves to render opponents' arguments irrelevant to the discussion. In other words, you're always trying to script the debate prior to its occurrence, prior to the execution, and be able to put yourself in a relatively superior position to your opponents. This accomplishes two things for debaters. First, it allows them to assess their arguments. Obviously, there are many potential arguments that a student could introduce in a debate, but you want to focus on the stronger answers. By anticipating your opponent's arguments, you can evaluate arguments in the debate and actually make a decision about which arguments to advance in a debate, which answers to make. In addition to that, you can determine which evidence or examples will be required to convince a judge or audience about the rightness of your position in a debate, the relative strength of your argument. And so, in this way, it allows for sufficient preparation to give someone a winning play in a debate. When refuting the central ideas of a debate, there are three issues to keep in mind. First, you have to have knowledge or history of the motion. Secondly, you need to be able to identify core issues. And thirdly, you need to be able to keep an argument record. Let me begin with a knowledge and history of the motion. For policy debating, this is a relatively simple task because a topic is selected for debate. The topic is presented to all the potential contestants in debates weeks or months in advance. of their debates. And so it's possible to simply identify key terms in a topic, research the basis for that topic, prepare or brief arguments for it. And so one can generally become quite adept at knowing the topic and having a sense of history of the ideas. In parliamentary debate, there's an entirely different foundation for researching a topic. After all, parliamentary debate is an extemporaneous event, and so issues will change from debate to debate. How is it possible then to research and prepare, to develop knowledge and history of motions? I think there are three things one can do. First, you can research issues that transcend topics. Research issues that transcend topics. There are many issues that transcend multiple topics. Here's an example: the issue of race and ethnicity. That affects our understanding of issues of war and peace, of human rights, of civil liberties, of notions of constitutional freedom, health and education. All of these issues are bound into our understanding of race and ethnicity. Research the issue of race and ethnicity to develop a perspective that it can give you on multiple topics. The same is true of a number of other issues that can transcend topics. Secondly, you can research issues in controversy. Most parliamentary debate topics are culled from current events. And so when one investigates domestic and foreign policy questions that are contemporaneous matters of controversy, you're likely to evaluate the very issues that will be debated at upcoming tournaments. Finally, you can examine previous topics. Topic language is different from the arguments that are advanced in a debate. Quite frequently, the same issues are raised again and again and again on topics that may be similarly worded, but may not be worded the same way at all. Let me give you some examples of topics on which issues associated with capital punishment were argued. Some of these are relatively obvious. Capital punishment is justified, or the individual ought to value the sanctity of life, or the United States should eliminate the death penalty. There are other topics, though, where the issue of the death penalty was argued, but it's less clear from the language of the topic that death penalty issues are automatically what the debaters might suggest. In the United States justice system, due process ought to be valued above the pursuit of truth. There are other topics on which death penalty issues have been evaluated. The United States would use force to make peace. This House believes that fanaticism works. The House believes that one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter, and this House rejects the American way of life. All of those topics have the death penalty as an element of the topic, such that it could be or ought to be argued on those topics. Through an examination of a history of topics, one understands that there are dramatic limitations on the scope of argument, even though topics are worded in decidedly different ways from debate to debate. Second major issue to refute central ideas: identify the core issues. The core issues of any topic are the ones that involve issues of significance. What do I mean by that? I simply mean that core issues are ones that have qualitative or quantitative dimension. In other words, it's got to matter a lot to an individual, and it should affect the lives of many individuals. And the arguments that matter a lot to a lot of people are the most salient ones for a debate. Finally, one should keep an argumentative record. This is done in a formal way in some respects. One could purchase Pros and Cons from BritishDebate.com. It is a text that reproduces a number of debates that have occurred historically by listing the arguments pro and con on all kinds of different debate topics. One could also keep a personal record of a history of argumentation. What's happened in the debates in which one has been a participant, and doing that allows you to examine the central ideas associated with a topic, anticipate the arguments from your opposing side, and be in a position to defeat them. I'm here to discuss the issue of refutation based on principles of relevance. It's important to begin this discussion by examining the goals that each side has in a debate. The affirmative or proposition side of the debate is arguing in favor of a motion or a specific interpretation of the motion, a plan of action, or some narrowed field of advocacy. The opposing side in a debate is trying to undermine those very claims. Arguments that support the proposition as interpreted by the government or proposition or affirmative side, arguments that support their case in that context, those arguments are relevant to the debate. Other issues are not relevant. For the opposing side, the arguments that challenge or undermine or contest the case, the proposition as interpreted by the government or affirmative team, those arguments are relevant to the debate. Other issues are not. There are many interesting possibilities for a discussion in a debate, but only the arguments that actually constitute a proof for an interpretation of a topic or undermine that case that's set out by the proposition or the affirmative side, the arguments that dispose the other side's arguments in the debate, those are the relevant issues. Other things are interesting but irrelevant. The other issue related to the issue of relevance involves importance. Importance. How substantial is an argument? And the one thing that I want to discuss here is the contextual nature of ideas' importance. Sometimes an idea is important, other times the very same idea is an unimportant one. The issue of relevance in a debate is not about whether or not one side's arguments relate to the opponent's position in a debate. We take for granted in a debate in which we're trying to promote clash on argument ideas among the various participants in a debate, we take for granted that the arguments will relate to each other. The issue is whether or not they are both related and meaningful, whether or not they are important, whether or not they're significant. And as I said, this issue is one that changes with context. Let me give you an example. If the state increases its searching authority of private persons, many people might view this as a threat to human rights or civil liberties, that it might endanger individuals' freedom in a relative relationship of the citizen's power with the state, and so it might be viewed as a danger. But if you change the context of that very same search, if it is a search for weapons of mass destruction, biological agents or nuclear weapons, and they are in a known neighborhood, to conduct a search under those circumstances might relieve citizens rather than threaten them. And so the very same circumstances in different contexts can be important or unimportant. And it is always the issue of relevance in the debate to advance related and important ideas. Argument selection is a very critically important element in debates, and the relevance of issues based on the relationship of one side's position to another, as well as the importance of issues, is the foundation for argument selection. There are some specialized arguments that are advanced in debates as well that are issues of relevance. One of these involves issues related to the topic itself. In policy argument, this is referred to as topicality arguments. These are also argued in some forms of parliamentary debate, and they're actually arguments about whether or not a government or affirmative team is upholding a literal interpretation of the topic. There's an expectation that they uphold a topic in its most literal sense, and that deviations from that mean that they are presenting an unpredictable, unknowing, expansive interpretation of the topic that in some way interferes with effective debate. This is an issue of relevance. If the affirmative or government team is off the topic, then one couldn't support their advocacy in a debate. And also the issue of specific knowledge in parliamentary debate, in which an opposition team argues, well, a case is not relevant to understanding a motion because it relies on information that is not available to the general public, is also an issue of relevance. And so arguments about relevance have to do with the substantive issues of the debate as well as the topic itself. A final comment about refutation based on issues of relevance. It won't go away because it's an efficient form of argument. If you're able to dismiss your opponent's positions because they are not relevant to the debate, that they are unrelated to the topic, that they are unrelated to the arguments that are advanced by your side in the debate, or if they are unimportant to the outcome of the debate. If you're able to dismiss arguments based on relevance, this is an efficient form of argumentation. It's efficient because you do not have to reply to the substance, the content of the argument. You're simply able to dismiss the entire position by arguing that it is not relevant, in other words, not worthy of consideration.
What I want to talk to you today is about refutation through critique. Let me try to define what a critique is. In most debate illustrations, critiques are there to challenge some of the fundamental assumptions associated with arguments being introduced in the debate round. They're not disadvantages. You're not saying that the policy being advocated is undesirable per se. What you're saying is there's some fundamental flaw associated with the policy as presented in the debate. They tend to be radical and often ideological criticisms of the subject matter or the approach taken by authors when examining the policy in greater detail. It's often very difficult to try to explain the types of critiques that are out there, and I will do my best. In terms of genre, let's talk about two, and I think that should be quite sufficient. The first genre of critiques that is used in academic debating deal with language, and they're associated with what courts in the United States have referred to as fighting words. In other words, what ends up happening in a debate is that a debater may stand in a debate round, and in the process of giving a speech, he or she may actually engage fighting words. They may use slurs that are ethnically insensitive. They may choose to present slurs which are religiously insensitive, or they might make arguments that are heterosexist. The fighting words approach in language critiques is quite basic. The argument would be that the opponent has engaged slurs as power words in the debate round in order to malign the arguments made by the opponent. And that strategy should be rejected on its face, that it's an irrationalist strategy, and anyone who would engage these types of fighting words to power into a debate should probably have their arguments rejected on face. It's the reason that we tend to degrade whatever power is associated to the arguments made by racists and the arguments made by sexists. So the first category of critiques are language critiques, and within that category are the language critiques associated with fighting words. These are acts that are actually occur in the debate, and it's where a debater uses slurs to power the argument into the debate round. The second category of language critiques generally are associated with otherizing, and it's normally associated with a professor named Edward C. Eade, who wrote a book on Orientalism many decades ago. But it has had its own approach when it comes to language criticism, because three of the most recent types of otherizing language critiques that have appeared has been associated with race speak, queer speak, and PC speak. And so the language critique in the debate would be a language critique where a debater has made an argument which offends the critical theory associated with otherizing, or otherizing whole categories of people. Predominant otherizing criticisms are associated with gender classes, and a good illustration of this is how the word family is used without really understanding the power associated with the word, since the word family carries standard connotations of the heterosexist family structure with a man as a traditional father and a woman as a traditional mother and family. What happens in a debate is someone may argue that the use of family as envisioned by the people who are being cited as evidence in the debate round are worthy of criticism because of their insensitivity. So in terms of the language category, there are the fighting words approach and there's the otherizing approach, both of which have been used in academic debate round. There's a whole other category. I'm just going to call them thinking critiques because I'm not sure what else to call them, and I'm not sure anyone in the field has really decided what to call them either. The first subcategory are ideological critiques. These are critiques associated with the ideas, often radical in nature. There's a whole series of neo-Marxist critiques. There's a whole series of legal studies critiques, things like critical legal studies associated with Kennedy and feminist legal studies associated with Scales. The ideological thinking critique would argue that the arguments being advocated by an opponent are ideologically biased, that they are not open to the sensitivities of other types of ideas. And there's a lot of excellent examples of this. The Said reference earlier on Orientalism, even though Orientalism was originally constructed as a criticism of how the West viewed Islam, it often can be examined in terms of how the West views the other world. Often we refer to simply as the third world. And when those types of arguments are introduced into the debate, debaters have argued that this Oriental ideological type of framing is wrong and should be rejected on its face. There's a whole field of study, for example, called feminist international relations, which gives you a good sense of what this type of criticism will be. Feminist scholars argue that our foreign policy has failed to include women's experiences and any sort of gender analysis into the calculation of policy. And feminism in IR critiques argue that international relations depends on the very specific definitions of what policy is in terms of terms like security and sovereignty and trade, and all of those constructs were constructs that have long been in the realm of men, and then have, as the dominant actors in the arena of international relations, have developed this current structure which needs to be rejected. Cynthia Enlow and many other experts in the field have extended this critique quite well. So there's a whole series of ideological critiques associated with thinking. Next, there's a whole series of thinking critiques associated with the calculus we use to try to decide what's important and what isn't important. Let me give you two quickly. The first is a very straightforward one. It's a critique of paramountcy. Paramountcy is a criticism, is a way of looking at things which claims that one thing is more important than another, often associated with imperatives that are advocated by a whole group of philosophers. Whether they're categorical in nature is irrelevant, but what ends up happening is we often see things as the most important things. The calculus of seeing things as the most important things tends to have problems. There's excellent criticisms of paramountcy, for example, from consequentialists. Another calculus criticism that's out there is the critique of normativity. The normativity critique, mostly drawn out of legal and constitutional fields, discusses whether anyone should be empowered to make should claims. In other words, no one really knows what needs to really be done to solve everything. No one has the authority, right, or duty to do that, and therefore should claims should be rejected on their face. And so the normativity criticism denies normative claims as a grounds for trying to make decisions. So in addition to the ideological critiques we have, which I gave you as illustrations of Orientalism and feminist international relations, there are critiques of the calculus of debate themselves, and two of the examples are paramountcy and normativity. How do we apply these in a debate round? Well, the strategy in a debate round in terms of using critiques is that the thing about critiques is critiques can be written by young students in academic debate who don't have access to an excessive amount of research resources. In other words, we can spend a considerable amount of time studying Orientalism and develop an Orientalism criticism that can be good in most debate rounds. And if we concentrate on that strategy, on the negative in debates, we may find, for example, that our Orientalist critique can get us a lot of distance since we know the material so well. The reason they become voting issues in the debate round has more to do on how arguments are constructed. Aristotle taught arguments in terms of syllogisms, and we know what a syllogism is because we've used them. You know, if A leads to B and B leads to C, then A must also lead to C. Well, one of those first two statements is called a major premise. The argument in critique theory is that when you enter a critique into the debate, it voids out the major premise. And if there's no major premise in the debate, then there's no real argument. Another approach associated with Stephen Toulmin argues that arguments are constructed in terms of data and warrants and claims. Now, if that's true in a debate round, we would argue that the critique voids out the warrant part of the argument, what allows the data to become a claim. As such, we would argue the argument is incomplete and it should be rejected. What are the drawbacks associated with these types of arguments? There are two major drawbacks. The first drawback was well articulated by C.S. Peirce when he started talking about overinterpretation. A gentleman by the name of Culler said, "One might imagine overinterpretation to be like overeating. There's proper eating and interpreting, but some people don't stop where they should. They go on eating or interpreting in excess and often with bad results." The argument is that the type of understanding we get in criticisms is actually over-understanding. It's beyond what the text demands and what the text should be teaching us. A second general criticism associated with critiques themselves is that debate may be the wrong venue for a discussion of these issues, that these issues are best discussed in a seminar type structure where there are no time restraints whatsoever and we can fully examine them in much greater detail. A very clever quotation by Booth puts it this way when he was trying to examine critiques, and he explained that sometimes what we learn in critiques is far excessive than what we really need to do. He said, "What do you have to say, you seemingly innocent child's tale of three little pigs and a wicked wolf, about the culture that preserves and responds to you, about the unconscious dreams of the author of folk that created you, about the history of narrated suspense, about the relations of the lighter and darker races, about big people and little people, hairy and bald and lean in fact, about the triadic patterns in human history, about the Trinity, about laziness in industry and family structure and dietary practice." He said about the history of manipulations of the narrative form. Is it good for a child to read you and hear you recite it night after night? He goes on and talks about the three little pigs, and he says, what about all that huffing and puffing? Well, we don't need to know about the huffing and puffing in order to understand the three little pigs. Booth makes that argument, and a lot of people claim that critiques provide that level of overstanding. We know what a critique is. It's a radical criticism. It falls into the category of language and thinking. It has an application in terms of its strategy. Remember, it's a voting issue because it eliminates major premises in syllogisms and warrants in the Toulmin approach, and it does have significant drawbacks as well, so it's not just a cure-all, but it is an option for someone who has limited research capabilities and can become really deep and understand a critique very, very well. Thank you.
Hello, I'm here to discuss the issue of refutation in its relationship to an argument that is referred to as turning your opponent's position, turning one's opponent's position. This simply is an argument tactic in which you use your opposing side's arguments against them. This has many obvious advantages for a refutation strategy in a debate. First, it's efficient. It's very efficient. You don't have to construct your own argument. You don't need to make argument claims or reason an independent issue in the debate, providing your own evidence or examples. You use your opponent's argument against them. They bring the information to the debate. You reveal why that argument sits with your side of the question rather than theirs. It eliminates many effective counterpositions from the other side in the debate. After all, one isn't really disputing the substance or the content of an argument. They are simply revealing to the judge the inaccuracy of the opponent's claim in making the charge that a particular argument either works against you or works in their favor. Rather, you're taking the position that if there is any negative consequence at all to the argument initiated by your opponent, that it is more a negative consequence for them. And if there is any positive consequence associated with that position, then it is more positively associated with you. In other words, you're capturing your opponent's argument, which doesn't leave them with many substantive options. They then must dispute the argument that you advance as to why you capture your argument, but that's the only genuine basis for serious refutation at that point in a debate. also it's viewed as being a very clever position by the majority of judges or members of audiences. It directly clashes with the opponent's argument. It's viewed as a very formidable position. It's also viewed as the height of debate skill. In fact, you don't need to have information, a knowledge or history of the opponent's ideas in the debate. Your information is not relevant when you turn your opponent's argument. What is relevant is your debate skill. You're able to take their information and use it against them. And so it is viewed as quite clever as a strategy. What example might I offer to make sure that everyone understands the value of the turn in the debate? Let me propose a sample in which a government or affirmative team argues in favor of national health care reform, emphasizing preventive care and installing preventive measures for health and medical care throughout a society. This might in fact cost billions of dollars, and this might be a position that the opposing side would take in the debate. Not a bad idea, but much too expensive. Those billions of dollars that would go to health and medical care would necessarily mean that there would not be enough money available for other social initiatives. As a consequence, the government would be in a position in which it would be forced to trade off health and medical costs with other social welfare costs, cutting more important social programs. What could the government or affirmative team do to defend their original position? They might argue that the kind of healthcare initiative that they're advancing actually saves money. It doesn't spend more money than it saves, and the reason why? The programs focus on prevention. And preventive health care and preventive medical care is dramatically more efficient than waiting until people are ill, particularly if they are seriously ill, and then treating them. That it's better to make sure that people do not have long hospital stays, that medical care is less invasive, and that there's less time that people need to be treated for their illnesses. And so someone might logically argue that they would in fact save billions of dollars, and they would stop any cuts in social programs that were forthcoming, or if social programs were on the precipice, they were about to be cut, they would move them away from being cut, and so they would better protect both healthcare initiatives and other social initiatives. And so in that debate, the government or affirmative side in the debate arguing in favor of a motion supporting healthcare initiatives would be able to say that in their utopian advocacy, they would be able to protect both the health of people and other social programs, where the opposition's position is to trade those off against each other. And they would reach the conclusion that because they were able to turn their opponent's argument against them, that they were in a position to win a debate. There are two kinds of basic argument turns. One turns the cause or link of an argument. It is referred to as a link turn. It focuses on the cause of a problem. For example, if the opposition argues A leads to B and B is a negative consequence, and so the affirmative's position in the debate is dangerous because they represent A, which will move us on a path to B, and B is a negative consequence. In theory, the government or affirmative team's position is, no, we do in fact represent A, but instead of moving us in the direction of B, we move away from that particular direction. For example, if we discuss the issue of nuclear proliferation, an opposition team might argue that nuclear proliferation leads to the likelihood of weapons use. More weapons available means more use. And so they would be making the claim that there are some dangers associated with proliferation, and for one reason or another, the government or affirmative team in a debate is defending the idea of nuclear proliferation. They're arguing that that's a bad idea. The proposition defense or affirmative team defense in that circumstance might argue that proliferation doesn't increase nuclear weapons use. In fact, it may dramatically reduce the likelihood of using nuclear weapons. And the example that they might offer is the post-war world in which the Soviet Union, the United States, China, France, and Great Britain, all possessors of nuclear weapons, did not engage in nuclear warfare, despite the fact that at various times there were hostile relations, in fact serious hostile relations among all of those parties. And so they might argue that proliferation actually protects us, that proliferation is a good thing in that it decreases the likelihood of weapons use. This is the way in which they would turn the cause of a problem against their opposing side. There's also what's referred to as an impact turn. This focuses on the consequence of an argument. For example, a government or affirmative team might defend the idea that nuclear power is bad, that nuclear power is dangerous because of the radiation pollution effects associated with nuclear power. The opposing side might argue nuclear power is in fact a good thing, turning the consequence, focusing on the issue of pollution by arguing that nuclear power plants stop carbon emissions and they stop radioactive emissions associated with burning sulfur compounds, which is found in fossil fuel plants. And they might argue that they reduce both the total amount of pollution and, in the specific circumstance, reduce radioactive pollution. And so they might argue that nuclear power is a good thing. The one thing to be careful of when making these kinds of arguments is losing because one's too successful. In other words, one should not advance an issue that is a link turn at the same time that one advances an argument that is an impact turn. In other words, you don't want to say that your opponent will cause a particular circumstance to happen and argue that that circumstance is a good thing. In the issue of nuclear power, an opposing side would not want to simultaneously say, you're going to be responsible for a large increase in nuclear power. Oh, and by the way, instead of nuclear power being a bad thing, nuclear power is a good thing. It would mean that the opposing side in that debate would now be supporting the increase of electrical generating power that was a good thing, that was relatively non-polluting. This would be an advantage to the other side, not a disadvantage to the other side. And so it's important to present either a turn argument that focuses on the cause or that focuses on the consequence, but does not do both.
I want to take just a few minutes to talk about the technique of refutation through minimization. That's where you try to make their claims look small. It's very important to remember that minimization is never a winning argument or a winning strategy all by itself, but it can be and often is a part of a winning strategy. No matter how small you make something look, it's still there. It still has some weight, some consideration. But if you make their claims really, really small, it's quite easy for you to outweigh them or counterbalance them with any number of other arguments which can also be fairly small. It is a very useful defensive argument. And I just quickly want to go through several different ways that you could try to minimize claims that other people make. The first thing is that you can quest for and analyze the number of times something happens. If they say a particular thing is bad, you would want to know how many times it happens. Can they prove that it happens that number of times? So if it's a very small number, you can minimize it. Often people will overclaim a larger number or a larger seeming amount than actually exists. Second, you can talk about the amount of harm that takes place in each given incident. Some things may happen to a lot of people, but they may not be that inconsiderate. If I stub my toe, that is profoundly different than if I have an accident in which my toe is cut off. You can question the amount of harm involved in each instance. Third, you can talk about the probability of whether anything like this will happen again or to any one person. If it's not likely to happen again, it may be really, really bad. But if it's not likely to happen again, and certainly not likely to happen to you as an individual, it's not that important. The fourth thing to keep in mind is the time frame between incidents. The time frame between incidents. Some things are really, really bad. For example, supposedly an asteroid hit the planet Earth and made the dinosaurs extinct. But this kind of thing doesn't happen very often. In fact, we will probably go hundreds of thousands of years before another asteroid, millions of years before another asteroid hits the Earth. So while it's serious, you can minimize it by talking about the time frame that may exist between incidents. Also, in terms of time frame, I think you can question anything that people say will happen farther in the future. You know, forecasting the future is a difficult thing to do. It's fairly difficult when you're trying to forecast for things that are going to happen in the immediate future. The more distant in the future their predictions of bad things, the more uncertain they're likely to be. The fifth way I think that you can refute through minimization is to talk about reversibility. Some things are more important than others because they cannot be reversed. I may lose my wallet, but I can get a new wallet. I may lose my credit card, I can get a new credit card. But if I lose my left arm, it's gone for good. We may, in fact, cause pollution on some pieces of land, but we might be able to reclaim and refresh those pieces of land. Those effects might be reversible. Other effects are not reversible and thus much more serious. For example, I've read that if we lose the Amazon rainforest, it will be gone forever. It's not likely to quickly regenerate. Those things that can be reversed and repaired are not as important. Sixth, I think there's a concept called voluntary risk. That is, if you voluntarily undertake a risk, then it's not as serious as if you involuntarily undertake it. I may decide to smoke cigarettes. I know they're dangerous. I know it could hurt my health, but I decide to smoke cigarettes. That's not as serious a problem when I get health effects because I knew what I was doing. It was my voluntary risk to do that. But if I smoke a lot around other people and secondhand smoke affects them involuntarily, it's not that important. See if you can identify things as being voluntary risks. 7, I think you can look at whatever it is they're claiming and examine it in terms of a percentage of the whole. If you take a whole group of something and this particular bad thing only happens to 1, 2, 3, or 4%, it's not quite as significant as if you look at them all by themselves. In comparison, right? What is the percentage of the total? 8th and finally, I think you can use comparisons through time and space. You know, things aren't perfect now, but they may be better now than they were, and they may be better here than they are in other spots. So it's not quite as bad as the other side may try to make it look, because it's better now than it has been, it's better here than it is in other places. That makes their claim look more like a plea for perfection than really the substantiation of an important argument. These are just some of the ways that you can engage in minimization as a way to refute arguments.